Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Harrison. Thank you for joining me today where we can talk about veterinarians, public health and conservation, and how all that ties together with agriculture and my mission. The points we're going to discuss today are, if you have a mission, maybe I can help you choose one, but put some passion behind your mission so that you have a purpose in life. We're going to talk about modern agriculture, and some of those concerns are monocropping, pesticides, confinement animal feeding organizations, or CAFO'S, and genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and how all this is tied into global environmental degradation and immune suppression around the world, and how I think we can all act together to make a difference. First of all, Mankind Project helped me find a mission, and my mission now is to express my passion for a world of organic agriculture and healthy food for people, their pets, and by teaching them and sharing these resources with others. First thing we have to realize that science is not exactly what we had thought it was. There's a lot of times where you have to decide what you're looking at, if it's actually a fact. So we have to put on our thinking cap when we're choosing our mission and the work we're going to do in the world. Critical thinking. Am I open to new perspectives and information? There's no question, according to experts like David Atherton, that the world is in a mass extinction. But he says, and I agree, that there is hope, but we need to act. And we act by finding our mission and making a difference. Our company, Harrison's Bird Foods, has found a way to balance the need in the market and advance our passion. My passion has become my mission, and we focus on making a better world by educating veterinarians and the public, bird owners especially, on the value of treating the soil as a living organism. The poor treatment of soil has killed the soil in many areas, and much of that is coming from the concentrated animal feeding organizations, and we'll go into more detail on that. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time on my grandfather's farm, which is in this painting by a mentor's wife, Betty Teets, as a graduation gift from high school. And my grandfather was one of the first people to have a feedlot and to do heavy equipment farming, and he was also one of the first ones to use pesticides. My father, up on the right-hand side, was a passionate person about hunting, about birds in our backyard. And in this picture, you can see looks like a long, slender object. That's actually a paddle wheel boat that he used as a martin house. And he also had a lot of wren houses and that. And we did go hunting. We didn't think it was bad to hunt. And so we spent a lot of time in the outdoors. But farming has evolved over time now to be more and more profitable and take more advantage of the land. And it was said at one time that you could a squirrel could walk across the United States and stay on trees all the way across. So some of the timelines in mega agriculture are seen here. Ireland in 1845 had a potato famine, and that was because they had one kind of potato, and they thought that that was the way to go. In the 1920s, we introduced monocropping into the United States. Monocropping means a single crop is grown to the exclusion of many others. In the 1920s, we started growing wheat in the United States. And by monocropping, it means that every year you grow wheat. And what happens, the soil doesn't recover. So in the 1930s, the United States experienced a major disaster in the environment called the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl devastated the Midwest, where all the wheat was being grown. In the 50s, my grandfather, like I said, was one of the first people to start using DDT on the corn borer. And I actually stood at the end of the rows with a marker to show the plane where to drop the DDT, and I'm sure I got my dose. In the 1970s, veterinarians and people that were seeing injured wildlife started rescuing injured wildlife, and we started to see what was happening to those creatures. And it was mainly to do with environmental degradation. In the 1990s, we saw science taking on the pesticides and showing that they not only cause cancers, but they cause immune suppression. And then in the 2020s, we saw devastation to beneficial insects and beneficial birds, and we're seeing cancers in people. The quality of the soil is extremely important for the value of the food that you raise from it. It's a living organism is how we're looking at it now, and it has all kinds of things that contribute to that. Large-scale farming is packing the soil down and not rotating and allowing these things to recover after crops are raised. So we're trying to get more carbon in the soil and more life in the soil and use less chemicals to hurt the soil. Well, that's not what mega agriculture is about. Companies profit on bigger is better, cheaper is better. So they raise a lot of corn, soybeans, and cotton using massive equipment that'll in the future be robotic. And science isn't helping this much. They've actually covered up the devastation of pesticides, showing very little effect on birds and insects, and they don't claim to take any responsibility for those chemicals. In fact, records have been falsified. One of the most harmful products is anhydrous ammonia. It's a gas that's harvested from oil industry, and it's put under pressure in the ground, but a lot of it leaks out, and we have problems from anhydrous ammonia as a source of nitrogen. So our main concerns with monoagriculture or mega agriculture is monocropping, the same crop being used over and over again. To do that, you have to control weeds and insects, and that's where pesticides come in. The end result is that you have a fairly nutritious crop used to raise mainly animals. We say that we're feeding the world, but we're mainly feeding animals, and it's not the most efficient way to do it. We also use genetically modified organisms, which allow us to use more and more pesticides. And the global environmental degradation and immune suppression are the results we're going to take a look at. So monocropping replaces the diversity that my grandfather and his relatives used. He raised corn, oats. I don't think I ever remember them raising wheat, but they raised a lot of oats. And oats was used as a bedding for animals, and then it was, after it got fouled with manure and urine, it was put in a compost pile and spread back on the soil. That's been stopped. So with monocropping, you use the same crop over and over, and corn, wheat, and soy are the biggest ones. But we're also seeing it now in almonds, avocados, and other crops under huge demand, where areas are just turned into an almond desert, if you will. #1 user of water in California. And this monocropping and using the same thing over and over, we have to use more pesticides and more GMOs every year because the bugs and the weeds are getting resistant. Monocropping is not sustainable, and what we're working on is sustainability. You can see back in the days of the Dust Bowl, when that biodiversity was lost, the soil didn't keep its moisture. Therefore, the organisms that lived in there, such as earthworms and all kinds of other little guys, they died out. And so the soil dried and cracked and became dirt and dust, if you will, when it lost those sponge-like humus characteristics we all knew of farm soil. Well, then along came dry winds and just buried homes and farms in dust, and people died by the thousands. The basic harm from monocropping is the lack of moisture in the soil that keeps things moving. The life forms in the soil die. And one that we're starting to understand more and more is the mycorrhizal community. And that's basically fungi that live in the soil and create a true community. They take care of each other. It's a fascinating subject to look at. And all of these things hinder the life forms in larger communities. So that affects birds, ground squirrels, all these things get affected by monocropping. In the United States, you have to prove it's harmful, whereas in Europe, you have to prove it's safe. And the difference is tremendous. So most of the things are allowed to continue to be used because it's so hard to prove harm. And that's why these chemicals are being manufactured in Europe and sold to all the suspecting countries that allow it, especially the United States and Brazil and Africa. Why are pesticides bad? Well, they indiscriminately kill. They not only kill the pests, but they also kill good things like birds, beneficial insects, and our fungi, the mycorrhiza that we were talking about. They're also dangerous to humans. They cause immunosuppression in humans, and there's now a link between the recent pandemic with COVID and glyphosate causing the environmental conditions to allow a pandemic to occur. There's also cancers, neoplasia, and endocrine diseases that are associated with imbalances in the microbiome of our bodies caused by pesticides. The runoff from these farms is also very dangerous to not only our water sources in the aquifers, but in the lakes and rivers and ponds. And then the chemicals leach down into the soil, and some of those changes take decades to correct. Mother Nature's answer to pesticides is to constantly change. So if it's a weed, it figures out a way to get around glyphosate. So they have to concentrate the glyphosate, or they have to add something else to it, like 2,4-D, which was banned for a long time, which was Agent Orange. But they're now using it again because glyphosate isn't working as well as it used to. They've actually increased the concentration and use of herbicides by 400%. Well, the resistance in insects has gone up to 300. So it's a constant race that's unsustainable. And that's why we need to look at another way to handle this. Pesticides are bad for wild birds. Rachel Carson Council showed that birds exposed to organochlorine pesticides all of a sudden couldn't recognize their mates. They didn't know how to sing to their mates. The mates didn't understand the song. They actually danced for their mates. Well, they quit dancing. And then the males had low sperm counts. And the birds were also incoordinated. So when they'd go out to find something to eat, they might stagger and fall or get hit by a car. They're much more prone to be captured by a predator. And we're seeing all kinds of information about birds running into buildings. We never saw birds running into buildings in the 1950s, and we had the Sears Tower and the Empire State Building. But these birds aren't normal. Their brains are damaged from pesticides. And in my opinion, that's why they run into windows. Yes, you can put things on the windows so they can see it easier, but they shouldn't be hitting the windows in the first place. It's also difficult for those animals to hunt, find prey, and feed their young. So a lot of the babies starve to death. And that's why it's hard to show the impacts of pesticides on wild birds. It's very difficult to track it. Most of the birds live out in an environment where there isn't a lot of people observing them constantly. So they might get sick and die from a pesticide, and they're not observed. Well, then somebody might see a sick bird along the road or in a bush by their house, but they don't do anything about it. And that's the second most common thing that occurs. And then there's some people who observe an animal not acting correctly and they contact someone, but most of the places they contact don't have the resources and the money to find out, well, why is the bird sick, let alone get it better. And then finally, there are birds that are observed, they're reported, they're confirmed, but that's a very, very small percentage, because just the histopathology to find out why a bird might have died could run into the hundreds of dollars, requiring an expert pathologist to make that diagnosis. The other thing that's happening is the habitats that birds use are being changed. So we see birds like the ibis in Florida on golf courses and on yards and along the roadways, and those are birds that should be in the Everglades. And the other group of birds that has been studied very extensively because of the Ducks Unlimited, which is a hunting organization, they've been banding and following what's going on with ducks for 50, 60, 70 years. And what they found is that in the areas where they filled in the land to drain ponds, that land is very moist and mucky, and therefore it grows some of the bad funguses, and therefore they have to treat those areas where they want to grow crops with fungicides. Well, fungicides devastate the small organisms that baby ducks eat. The microcrustacea that live in the water of those ponds is poisoned by those pesticides, so that they die and then the baby ducks starve. So there's been like a 40% reduction in the Midwest duck population. And this is what we're talking about with concentrated animal feeding operations, where animals are crowded into them. There's just no space in there. And there's no way that that could be part of the veterinarian's oath. Those animals, in my opinion, are being treated inhumanely, and it's an ecological disaster. They use cheaper and cheaper food with massive additives into their foods to make it so those animals will put on weight as fast as possible so they can be slaughtered. But then there's this massive amount of urine and feces and food and feathers and the chemicals that they're feeding them that have to go somewhere, and they're not being sustainably maintained. They're often kept in ponds. The ponds have been breaking down and running into the environment. So the concentrated feeding of animals is not the way to go. In cattle, for example, they force diet. Now, cattle are herbivores. What is an herbivore? An herbivore means they eat grasses and leaves and things from herbs, plants. Well, corn is a plant, but the corn stalk has a corn ear on it, and that is a highly concentrated carbohydrate that cattle were not supposed to eat. So when they are forced to eat corn, and soybeans are another thing that they would not eat naturally, they have to give them chemicals to stop the digestive diseases that they contain. They pass off massive amounts of a gas called methane, and methane is considered one of the strongest environmental pollutant gases. They have to give those cattle antibiotics, antifungals, anti-bloat, digestive aids, and growth stimulants. And that's the kind of thing that's in your meat that you're eating from CAFO'S. The methane output is a major contributor to global warming, and cattle alone, they think, have one of the major impacts on the Earth's atmosphere, especially when they're growing in these confinement operations. A little less so when it comes to grass-fed, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the solid waste that comes off that goes somewhere, and for decades it was just allowed to run into rivers and ponds and ended up in the Mississippi River in the United States. And now around the world there are dead zones, literally hundreds of dead zones where these types of feeding operations and all the pollution from it have killed everything in the water around it. And that's true of the dead zone off the mouth of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico at New Orleans. We thought it was getting better in 2020, but what was happening, we were getting so many storms and so much water in the storms that hit Texas and Louisiana. They were diluting that dead zone down, so it looked like it was improving, but it was actually just a false impression. The other thing is genetically modified organisms devastate insects. and one of the main ones is honeybees. And one of the chemicals that's used that's really devastating to honeybees is nicotine. That's from tobacco. It's now been genetically introduced into houseplants and yard plants. So if you're going to plant plants in your yard, make sure they don't contain nicotinamide. And that's devastating bees. GMOs also have been associated with common human allergies, such as gastrointestinal diseases. Gluten allergies are being blamed on the impacts of GMOs. But there are many long-term consequences from GMOs that we have no idea what we're looking at. But if we look just at the global waste from our food system and then the way we grow things, we've got these huge populations of dumps, is what it looks like, where people live trying to eke out a way to survive. So we did talk about hope. So there are things you can do to change these things. And one is that you get educated and make sure that you're not following the wrong information. So you do have to do your homework. But the solution is to buy organic and non-GMO products and spread the word. Teach your kids, your friends, your families, and you'll see in a matter of weeks, if you get on an organic diet, that you start to feel better. Educate yourself about this modern agriculture and the techniques that we've discussed and how companies are avoiding talking about those practices that are irresponsible. Find a source and do a deep dive on where you get your food or where they get their food. And if you can find local farmers, in Florida, it's nice to buy from a farm market, but because bugs and weeds are just absolutely out of control in Florida, it's very difficult for an organic farmer to not use some form of pesticides. So we don't always get the same pesticide-free foods from Florida that we'd get from say, Nebraska or someplace where there's not so many weeds and so many bugs. Learn where your food comes from. Getting the nutritious food that you deserve to eat without destroying our environment. So grass-fed animals are part of the solution, but in the United States, you can now bring grass-fed animals in from Brazil. So that means that and they don't have to tell you that those grass-fed meats are from Brazil. So why is that a problem? Well, what's going on in Brazil? Well, they're taking the Amazon and burning it, first of all, then draining it and turning it into pastures for grass-fed beef. And then they have the same situation as we have. They have CAFO'S to put the final fat layers on it so they get the maximum price. But you can feed your family and yourself organic foods. And that's the most significant thing you can do to reduce the glyphosate that's in breast milk and our urine. And it takes about 2 weeks, I believe, actually in 3 days, where they did a study on children and adults that had high levels of glyphosate in their system. And they put them on organic certified diets. And within 3 days, they reached a baseline. So you can improve. You won't see emotion or physical and wellness feelings in 3 days, but you can test and show that the glyphosate's gone down. So feeding organic foods for you and your pets. They've actually found that if they feed humic acid, which is like a apple cider vinegar and charcoal, to cattle on those terrible diets, they produce less methane. So they are trying to improve that. Harrison's Bird Foods works with Grain Place Foods. They've been organically farming since 1953. And that's the challenge now, since organic foods are becoming so expensive, is more and more certifiers. What is organic? It means that the government, United States Department of Agriculture, has this seal, USDA organic seal. I, as a farmer, have to go out and find some third-party certification company to come in and make sure that I'm farming my ground correctly, that I'm harvesting it correctly, all the things that go into making sure it's organic. Then once it's picked, it has to be followed from the time it's picked until it's sold. And that's how USDA works, by third-party certifications. So anytime you have non-government organizations, it's a possibility for someone to push the edges a little bit. So not all USDA certified organic certifiers are the same as each other in quality. So you have to maybe talk to some of the people in that industry and say, well, who's the best certifier? And we've had to change certifiers a couple times because they've weakened their processes. And now you can ensure that the food you're eating is non-GMO. Watch the science, understand it, read it, vote with your dollars, spend money on brands that you trust. Tell your family, friends, and clients, anyone who will listen, that organic foods are the answer to our health and our environmental disaster, at least a big part of it. Here's some of the things you can check out. We have a podcast, HBD Chats on YouTube. There's several lists here for reading about the things that we've talked about. There's some films that are coming out right and left now to show you that this isn't just a theory. This is something we all have to get together and do. Thank you for your time.